Hello there again. David Risley here with the Blog Marketing Academy and bringing another episode of Coffee Break Blogging to you. Now, today I actually want to talk about the podcast itself because if you haven't noticed, I don't have a big musical jingle at the beginning of this podcast, like a lot of podcasts maybe you listen to. And it's one of those things that I actually did put some thought into and trying to decide how to do it. And so today I want to talk to you about the idea of just simply rethinking podcast norms and questioning the things that people do out of habit. Now, in the past, if you've listened to Coffee Break Blogging before the new format, I did have a pre-recorded intro, and we would just tack it on there along with an outro in every single episode. Now, we kept editing very basic on those things, but it was still this repetitive thing that we had to do every single time. I would put the file in the Dropbox. My VA would then go and put the intro and the outro on there, even out the audio, blah, blah, blah. But it was an extra step that needed to be done. But then when I was thinking about how to bring this podcast back, I got to thinking about this. Is it really necessary? Now, one thing I know from all of my time in the business is that there are a lot of things that people just sort of do. It's kind of like a habit. They're looking at what other people do. They think this is just the way things are done, and then they just kind of do it because it's considered normal and they see everybody else doing it. Now, they may not ever actually question whether it makes a whole lot of sense, but they will just do it in another case of following the leader. After all, if the big guys do it, and I'm putting that in a big air quote, it must be right? So you see a lot of it in the world of podcasting. For instance, you see most shows copying the exact same interview format. Everybody wants to have an interview show. It's like they all watch John Lee Dumas come out with Entrepreneur on Fire with the interview model. He's obviously doing really well, and everybody wants to get a piece of that action. And so you see just tons and tons and tons of interview formats, which is one way was like, okay, well, that's a lot of work. I mean, there's some definite value there in the interview format, but it doesn't mean it's the only way to put out a valuable show. And there's a lot of logistics that go into that. Or in other cases, how you see everybody, including me for a while, put abbreviations and show numbers right on the beginning of the actual show title. Like you'll be scrolling through the feed and you'll see like CBB 150 or something like that. And if you really think about it, though, that episode title is essentially your headline. It's super important. It's extremely valuable real estate as a podcaster, the show title. But yet we use the first beginning characters there of that show title with something boring like CBB 150. And so I notice now that iTunes does it a little bit differently, and they're actually encouraging you not to put episode numbers into your title anymore because they now have a separate field for that, which is actually a really good thing. But the point here is that, it's sometimes you need to rethink how things are done. And I got to thinking about the intro. Everybody seems to want to get some intro for their podcast, and they want it to sound sort of like a radio show. They hire somebody to go out there and record this fancy audio intro for them with this jingle to it. Maybe they try to cheap out and they go to Fiverr and have somebody do it. Either way, it's considered normal that you have to have some kind of a musical jingle at the beginning of your show. But why? Now, I listen to podcasts. I'm also a consumer of podcasts. Personally, I find intros to be completely unnecessary. It's a waste of time because I hear the exact same intro every single time. I already know it. And so for me, it's basically dead air. I much prefer when the host of the show just launches right into the content. Now, it's totally fine and smart for the host of that podcast to spend like 5 seconds at the beginning identifying the podcast, identifying themselves, and then saying what they're going to talk about. That's fine. That's totally cool. But to have some 15 or 30-second musical jingle there that sounds like a radio just is a complete waste of airtime, in my opinion. And personally, I find myself hitting the little 15-second skip function on my iPhone when I'm listening to podcasts, specifically to get through all the garbage at the beginning so that I get into the content of the show. And so if that's my habit, and I did some surveys of this, and other people do the same thing, we have to back up and go, do we need an intro? And I'm going with the answer of no right now. I actually did go to Facebook. I asked about it, and the majority of people agreed with me. They looked at the podcast intro as unnecessary filler. One guy even called them annoying. Some said they sort of like it, but I think they were kind of coming at it from the perspective of best practices, not because they actually personally love listening to the same jingle over and over again. So, do we need a podcast intro? Like, is it actually necessary? Or has it just become this tradition that we do it because we see everybody else doing it? For me personally, I'm choosing to skip the intro and just do it myself every single time. It'll be really brief because I want to get into the content, because that is what you're here for. I want the podcast to be a personal experience between me and you. Me just jumping in and delivering something actionable that you can do or think about. You guys listen to this podcast for the content, not for me to put some pre-recorded musical jingle at the beginning and waste your time. Okay, so that's my thought. And then just as a one final note, as a general basis, it's okay to question the norms. Just because you see a lot of other people doing it doesn't mean that it needs to happen that way. Sometimes there's not really any valid reason for it other than the fact that everybody saw everybody else doing it. It's sort of like how internet marketers like to have prices that always end in the number 7. There's no reason for that. It doesn't convert any better. It's just a big funny joke at this point, but they still all do it, and it's only because they're all watching each other and they're like, oh, they must know something, and then they do it. And I sort of think there might be some truth to that with all these musical jingles on our podcast. Now, it depends on the nature of your podcast, obviously. If some people, their podcast is really legitimately a radio show. Sometimes they really are just going for a different type of thing, and that podcast is a much more important medium to them. For me, it's not. This podcast is really valuable. However, it's one of several different platforms that I have going on, and it's just the intro is not the most important thing, and so it's okay to question it. All right, hopefully you found that interesting, maybe valuable, maybe get you thinking a little bit, and I will see you on the next episode of Coffee Break mañana.